and it instilled in me a lifelong love of sport, and so sports journalism was something that I always wanted to do. However, St. Benedict's gave me that incredible educational grounding, and I'll be forever grateful for this very, very good education that I got. I have very mixed feelings about St. Benedict's because I also was at the school at the time where we had some really awful teachers who at the drop of a hat would cane us, and that kind of, I look at it, it's nothing short of brutality and assault, and it's amazing how it actually does leave a bit of a festering sore in your head about the way the school is. And I've never been involved with St. Benedict's because I have these very mixed feelings about it. And it does actually make me swell with pride when I see what St. Benedict's has become and how prominent it is. And as my sons went through the schooling system, I never ever heard somebody say to me, St. Benedict's, that's such a school. I never ever heard that. Everybody tells me what a magnificent school this is, and I start feeling that kind of nostalgia for this establishment. And then we hear the names as I'm chatting to some of the people here of the teachers that made a difference in my life. And I think, there were some good people. I tended to only remember the bad ones. Or you might feel the same way. I don't know, if you're coming from the same era, you know the teachers that I'm talking about. Brother Barber and his cane. Father McGrail. He had a cane, he called it, it was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Wham! That's right. The cane was called Wham. And because it made a lovely whistling noise as it caned you. The cane is on our bare backsides, and I had to say, what's that all about? Anyway, when I left St. Benedict's, I went to Rhodes University because my father had been to Rhodes, and he was very disparaging of Rhodes. He was actually a chemistry lecturer there at one time, and he said, to get into Rhodes University, all you need is an ability to read or write. I stand corrected, an ability to read or write. He was that disparaging about Rhodes. I went to Rhodes and studied journalism. It's not an academic pursuit. It was an ability to learn how to drink and how to party. But I grew up actually by going to Rhodes University. From Rhodes, I went to the army. I was an army journalist, and that's where my grounding in journalism came from. They often talk about in journalism you have to do the cat under the tree stories, the very banal stories. Well, in my case, it was the medal parades. But because I was an army journalist, I could hop on military transport just by showing my army ID and the classification that I had. I could fly anywhere in the country and go and report on stories. I could even go to the border, which I did quite a few times. We were then fighting a war in Angola. My movements were very restricted and my reporting was heavily censored, but I could go out there, and it was a wonderful eye-opener to see what was happening and what was really going on and what the public knew about. It was that understanding of the level of censorship and the stifling of information in those years, so this is now the 1980s I'm talking about, that helped me when I got into journalism properly. I had, as a student, got an internship at Capital Radio, which was the first independent radio station in South Africa, and it was an incredibly exciting place because up until then the only radio news we had was the SABC's news, and that was subject to the whims of the political masters, the National Party at the time. This was now an independent radio station that was a lot more free to report on the other side of things, almost activist journalism, if you will. We could say the words African National Congress without saying the terrorist organization, which is the SABC style. And that really appealed to me, to go and be involved in a radio station that could try and break the barriers, the shackles of censorship, and report a lot more of what really was going on in South Africa. And that took me into the townships to report on what was going on there, and bringing the stories that everyday people in the townships were experiencing and white South Africans knew absolutely nothing about because of this heavy censorship. It was also a time when we had a state of emergency, and we were even more shackled as a result of the state of emergency. And I'll tell you a quick story about that. The number of times that we would go into, say, Soweto, and we would see what I can only describe as ultra-violence. It was just a civil war, not even a low-grade civil war, but an actual civil war going on, where army, soldiers, police, and the political party they were aiding and abetting at the time in Kapa Carter were attacking the residents, and the residents were fighting back with the self-defense units. And we would watch running gun battles in the streets of Soweto, and then you were only able to report it if you had permission from a designated police official. And the various areas of the country were broken up, and a designated guy was put in charge. And there was a Colonel Swanicle, who was our guy. If we wanted to report something we'd seen, we would then say to him, we saw this incident, we'd give him chapter and verse about what happened, and then he would decide whether we could report it or not. And it would always come back, you cannot report that. And so we would go to the pub and drink our sorrows away. This is amazing. We have seen, I remember going to a situation out on the West Rand, outside the Telspruit Hospital at the police station there, and I counted 20 dead people in a pile. And I went back and I said, this is what has happened overnight. 20 people have been killed in the Telspruit. You cannot report that. And so the rest of South Africa is completely oblivious. Life goes on. But the people of Natalspruit, they knew what had happened in their own backyard. The thing about it as well was that I was in my 20s and I was bulletproof. And so it was an incredibly exciting world. You felt that when you came back to the radio station after being out in the field for the whole day, that if you didn't stink of, if your lips weren't burning from the tear gas and the corners of your eyes weren't burning, if you didn't have a sore chest from the tear gas, if you weren't exhausted and covered in dust from running away from the gun battles, then you hadn't had a good day. You needed that. And I realized I became more and more an adrenaline junkie doing this kind of thing. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't a thing that really we thought about or cared about, because, hey, life went on. Only in retrospect you realize that we coped with it by drinking a lot. And I thought this is just the remnants of Rhodes University, where that's all we ever did was drink a lot. Then I kind of hit a wall working at Capital. We did the release of Nelson Mandela, which obviously is one of the highlights of my career. In fact, the announcement of the release not the release of Nelson Mandela, but the unbanning of the ANC, which was done by F.W. de Klerk on the February the 2nd, 1990, is one of my favorite things that happened while I was the news editor at Capital Radio. And what happened was that in Parliament, it was at the opening of Parliament that he made the announcement, and our parliamentary reporter in Cape Town was part of the cohort of journalists that were given the speech in advance, but they were put into what was called a lockup. So they gave these guys the speech ahead of time, and they could then write their stories so that they would hit the afternoon newspapers. If they had to sit in Parliament and listen to the speech, then they would miss the printing deadline. And the party, the National Party, well, it was well known that that's the way you did these things. So that when 11 o'clock came, they weren't now listening for the first time. They had already written their stories, and they were now going through the news cycle, being edited, typeset, printed, all of the things that used to happen in the archaic old days. So this guy's name was Dennis Krabach, and he went into lockup. And there, of course, he was unbanning the ANC, the South African Communist Party. This was going to be the most earth-shattering of all parliamentary speeches. And he snuck out, and he faxed it to me. So at 8 o'clock in the morning, I had the story. And so we started preparing our journalists and getting them to major places like sticking a microphone under Cyril Ramaphosa's name. He was then he was the Secretary General of the ANC at the time. Jay Naidoo, who was the General Secretary of COSATU. We'd go to all the political activists who weren't banned and weren't in detention, people we could quote. We had our reporters sitting there with microphones ready to record their natural reaction when those words came out on their TV screens. And then I noticed at the top of the speech it said, embargo upon delivery, which meant that every time he said a word, that was now unembargoed. So it was embargoed, unembargoed. And so I realized that what we should do is we should time it. That's what it should have said. What it did say was embargoed until 11 o'clock. It should have said embargoed on delivery, but it said embargoed until 11 o'clock, which is when he was about to start speaking. So I said, okay, in the 11 o'clock news, that's the first word. Nelson, the ANC has been unbanned. And our newsreader went in, he had the story all read. 11 o'clock came, bam, he announced it. I was watching on the TV, de Klerk was still getting to his feet and walking up to the podium. The security police phoned us and gave me such a bollocking. And I said, it says embargoed until 11 o'clock. I just hung up on me. But it wasn't the first time they'd come. The security police were often visiting us, and we followed, our phones were tapped. But again, I remember these young journalists I was talking to when I worked at 782, they were saying, but that must have been terrifying times. I said, my God, it wasn't terrifying, it was brilliant. Because if you weren't being followed and your phone wasn't being tapped, then you were doing something wrong. It meant you were lame. There was one occasion where we were trying to report on Archbishop Tutu, who had made a call for the boycott of the 1987 election, which was the first election I covered. And this election now was the first I've never covered. I was not involved in any way. And it was so funny, standing in a voting queue for the first time, because normally we did special votes the day before because we were working on election day. So last week was a bit mad for me. But there was a rule in a law, it was in the emergency regulations, that you may not call for a boycott of the elections. You remember in those days we had what was called the tricameral system, the Indian chamber, coloured chamber, and white chamber. And the Indian and coloured communities, there was a very strong anti-vote vote boycott call. So they put in the regulations that you were not allowed to call for a boycott of the elections. And furthermore, you weren't allowed to report on a boycott of the elections under pain of imprisonment. So we were out at an event, and Archbishop Tutu stood up, and he didn't care. He was there saying, boycott, you must not go. And of course we couldn't report it because we would be jailed if we had. And I thought there must be a way around it. And so the way we put it out on air was this. We said, Archbishop Tutu has addressed a gathering in Vereeniging, and the contents of his speech we may not report, because in terms of section 17B, it is illegal to report on a boycott of the elections. And again, the security police were around. They were saying, right, we said, hold on, all we've done is we've reported the regulation. So what they should do is put another one, you may not quote the clauses in these regulations. And then the police left. But it wasn't clever to incur their wrath, but we loved baiting them. And they were, we'd see them in the pubs. They'd be in the corner with their short haircuts and almost their safari suits, looking very forlornly at the bunch of journalists who were getting pissed, having a wonderful time. Guys, we want to go home. I remember we once sent drinks around to them as we were leaving. We said, get a table of drinks for those guys and then stop it. And then the next day, I went into the office and received a very abusive call from an anonymous person. Okay, he was one of the policemen who wasn't impressed that he'd been identified. But I did hit a wall after the release of Mandela. I did the Namibian elections, independence, not the elections, the independence of Namibia, which was an amazing time. And then we went into that dreadful cycle of the genocide in Rwanda, which mercifully I didn't go to, but a couple of my colleagues did, and they came back completely traumatized. And this whole issue of post-traumatic stress became a very real thing. And I felt that I had enough of running, watching street battles, dodging bullets, and putting myself in danger. And I was more intrigued by ways in which we could break the censorship and assist journalists in doing much better reporting. I always felt our lawyers gave us very conservative advice. And I decided at the age of 30 to go back to university and go and study law, which is what I did. I made my money working as a foreign correspondent for a lot of radio networks. As Rob mentioned, I worked for Voice of America, Australia Broadcasting, networks in Britain and in Europe, and got paid in foreign currency. So I stored all of that up and I put myself back through university. Very quickly ran out of that money and managed, though, to get myself a job as an article clerk at Webber Wentzel Attorneys in their media law department for my final LLB year, to do my articles over 2 years and work there. So they wanted somebody who'd been a journalist to go and work with journalists, because I came with that understanding, and so that's what I did. But an article clerk salary after being the news editor at Capital Radio didn't really keep me going for too long. And then a mate of mine was at 702, a guy called Jeremy Maggs, and he said, why don't you come and freelance for us on the weekends, which is what I did. And I subsequently did the 2 biggest stories of my life in that period, when I was actually a law student and then an article clerk. And the first one was the Vishu massacre, where it was September, and it was the holidays, university holidays, and I should have been studying for my final exams, but I had no money. And a bunch of journalists, I was living in Yeovil, we were all in one of the pubs in Yeovil on one Sunday, and they said, you know what, there's going to be this ANC march from King Williamstown to Vishu the next day. Why don't we go? Because nobody's going. There was I remember a big ANC news conference in Joburg the next day as well. And most of the foreign journalists were going to that, and very few people were going to go to this march. What if something happens? There'd been a march 3 weeks prior, and nothing happened. And on a whim,